RNAi and exon-skipping therapies headline the list of regulatory and pivotal data catalysts in 2026. Meanwhile, new lipid-lowering mechanisms, modalities, and precision medicines will define the year in cardiovascular disease. Part 2 of our discussion of the catalysts that will drive biotech this year is on the plate for this week's BioCentury This Week podcast. And we'll also discuss a new regulation in China introducing orphan drug exclusivity, a move that could bolster the market for rare disease drugs and incentivize their development. I'm Jeff Cranmer, host of the BioCentury This Week podcast, and joining me today are my colleagues.
Simone Fishburne, Editor-in-Chief.
Selena Koch, Executive Editor.
Lauren Martz, Executive Director of Biopharma Intelligence.
And Steve Usden, Washington Editor.
All right, we'll be jumping into the second part of our discussion of the key catalysts in the biotech sector in just a moment. Of course, you'll remember, or if you didn't remember, and you are interested in neuro catalysts, check out last week's podcast. Selena gave us a little preview of her deck and story that she cooked up for us. But first, BioEquity Europe. It's coming up in May. This year's theme, the need for speed, how Europe can compete in the new era. It's the first time we're taking our long-standing conference, this will be the 26th year, to Prague. Advanced pricing is in effect through April 2, and that's no joke. Limited presenting company presentation slots and sponsorship opportunities remain. Don't wait. This meeting always sells out. If you're interested in being a presenting company, reach out to me directly, and our sponsorship team can be reached at conferences@biocentury.com, and you can go to bioequityeurope.com. All right. RNAi. Lauren, great deep dive here. Where do you want to start?
Thanks, Jeff. When we're talking about the RNAi catalysts, RNAi and antisense catalysts for 2026, I think the big one that we're hearing a lot about sort of covers that new modality theme. And it also covers the cardiovascular disease theme. That is the highlight of another one of the stories that we ran last week. And that is the first phase 3 data for an Lp(a) program. This half, we expect to see phase 3 data from the Horizon study of pelacarsen. And this is from Ionis and Novartis, and this is a cardiovascular outcomes trial. So this will be the first time that the hypothesis is tested. The hypothesis of whether reducing Lp(a) actually translates to cardiovascular benefits for the patients who have high levels of this target. So that's about 30%, up to 30% of cardiovascular disease patients. So it could possibly be a pretty important contributor to, residual risk in patients who are treated with other mechanisms. I think this is a big deal for the RNA field and the cardiovascular disease field, just because, well, first of all, it's a big deal for the target because it's a very popular development area right now. This is one of 4 programs in phase 3 testing across different modalities against this target. It's the only one to read out this year. And it's from phase 2 data, the levels of Lp(a) reduction achieved for this program are slightly lower than the other 3 programs. So if this is successful efficacy-wise, that's a good indicator for the other programs. We've also heard from companies in earlier stages of development that how this study turns out might determine whether they go forward with a compound that they already have more advanced in preclinical development versus trying to come up with something that can reduce Lp(a) levels even further. Yeah, I think it's potentially another example of an RNA or antisense therapy in this cardiometabolic space that could become a clinical success. It's kind of making this modality more established. We've recently seen the PCSK9 field move forward too. We'll see what happens.
So on the Lp(a), I think it's also, it's going to be an important benchmark, the extent of Lp(a) reduction they see relative to how much clinical benefit they see. Everybody will learn from that. But I think the other interesting parameter there is just durability, right? I think these next ones coming down the line are longer acting, perhaps.
And would you say that that's really going to be what makes them take off versus small molecules or something like that? The ability of RNAi to just produce, what are they shooting for, Lauren? Once a year, like twice a year at the moment? I think ultimately, Vas Narasimhan from Novartis has talked about trying to get very long acting products out there. So how much of this is dependent on their ability to be really long lasting as a modality?
Well, I think that's incredibly important for all of these RNA targeting, RNA-based therapies. That's the benefit that we're hoping to see. That's the difference from taking, your statin every day. But within the Lp(a) space, this is a precision medicine opportunity. These are, this will be for potentially a targeted group of patients. And as I mentioned at the beginning, there are multiple different modalities in the advanced stages of development for reducing Lp(a). So I think how successful each one is will depend on the durability, will depend on, as Selena mentioned, how much the risk comes down with its ability to reduce levels of Lp(a). So
but it's great to see a genetic target advancing. And even though it's precision, and it's great that it's precision, and that's going to increase its chances of success, it's also large, right? So it's
exactly
windows of opportunity. Yeah.
What about outside of cardiovascular or cardiometabolic? Because you've also been looking at the neuromuscular space, right? Talk a little bit about that and the importance of RNAi there and the catalysts.
Sure. So with the catalyst that we found and that we chose to focus on, we found 10 phase 3 trials across different indications that are expected to read out for antisense or siRNA therapies this year, which is a lot. And I think what was interesting for me was the fact that it spans so many different indications. You've got a phase 3 trial from Roche for IgA nephropathy, Angelman syndrome is in there. And then, as you mentioned, a bunch of the siRNA phase 3 readouts are for musculoskeletal diseases. There are also a bunch of exon-skipping antisense in there too. I think that there's been a lot of activity in DMD, for example. Everyone's following the gene therapy approval. There's the potential for a second gene therapy to maybe reach the market this year from REGENXBIO. And just given anyone who's been following the story of the gene therapies in this indication, I think having a second option is a really big deal for patients. There are also next generation versions of the exon-skipping therapies that will have late stage data this year. The exon 53 and exon 51. I think there's an exon 54, which doesn't have any approved therapies, with a big step change in the level of exon skipping and the level of dystrophin expression that's achieved with those. So that could be really important for patients. And then there are multiple late stage milestones in musculoskeletal diseases that don't have approved therapies. Myotonic dystrophy type 1 could see phase 3 data this year, and FSHD could also have phase 3 data, which I think is very exciting.
Let's take it from the company perspective. Maybe some of the leaders in this particular technology. I mean, obviously, Ionis has been an antisense forever as a pioneer, but it seems like it's going to be a big year, an especially big year for them. They have 4, I think, readouts, pivotal ones in your analysis deck. They have some regulatory things happening, but who else should we keep an eye on?
Sure. So when we're talking about big pharmas, there are quite a few from Novartis. So Novartis has some programs that are collaborations with Ionis. We mentioned pelacarsen. The myotonic dystrophy and FSHD programs that will have phase 3 readouts are coming from Novartis. Novartis is also acquiring Avidity, which should have some phase 3 data this year. We have companies like Arrowhead and Wave that are very active in the late stage catalysts as well. Biogen has some spinal muscular atrophy data expected and some data for an anti-tau. So there are a lot of players that are listed in our story about this topic.
Well, Lauren, I guess there's another company you got to mention too, right? Alnylam.
Of course. Yeah. So Alnylam features a lot in our proof of concept catalyst analysis. They have a bleeding disorder program that should have phase 1 and phase 2 data this year. There's an RNAi therapy for Huntington's disease that's a partnership between Alnylam and Regeneron. So definitely another player to watch in this space.
All right, yeah, you can't not mention Alnylam when it comes to talking about key catalysts, the way that company has been rolling over the past couple of decades. Lauren, Renal also factored into the 3 stories you wrote for this 5-part package of catalysts. What was the most compelling thing you found in that space?
So there were 2 take-homes from the analysis of the renal disease catalysts. And this was a smaller set, but I think it's just a really important space right now. So the first is that the progress that we've seen in IgA nephropathy is going to continue. There's a ton of activity that's still coming up through the pipeline for this indication that's seen 5 drugs approved in the past 5 years. And the other take-home message is that other indications within this renal disease space, I think, are starting to kind of benefit from the clinical development and regulatory path that's been created for IgA nephropathy. So there are at least 3 renal diseases that don't have therapies specifically approved to treat them that will either have late-stage data or regulatory submissions this year. What's been happening in IgA nephropathy is the first approval was in 2021 based on a surrogate
First
endpoint.
ever. I mean, that's one of the things you really highlighted, right? It was like 5 years ago, there was nothing for that.
Absolutely. And this was based on reduction in proteinuria as a surrogate endpoint. And, that data, the fact that it was able to be used then, it's been used for these subsequent approvals and, the whole body of evidence supporting that surrogate endpoint is what's made that an attractive development path for a lot of companies. So we continue to see additional programs and additional mechanisms move through the pipeline for this indication. We have 6 potential catalysts based on our list. 2 of them are BLA submissions, 3 of them are phase 3 data. So
yeah, on that, what really struck me, Lauren, is you have the full pipeline in there. I think there's like 15 development programs that you highlighted, even if some of them don't have catalysts this year. Just goes to show you what happens when you have a well worked out regulatory path like that. Yeah.
And in some cases, these are therapies that are approved for other indications. So we can, take it forward in this, what used to be an untreatable disease based on that pathway. And then my second point was these other renal diseases that are having potentially important readouts this year. So there's APOL1 mediated kidney disease. We are highlighting 2 catalysts. One of them is an interim phase 2/3 readout. We've also got proof of concept data that's from Vertex and Maze Therapeutics. FSGS, there is a PDUFA date for Filspari from Travere, which is already approved for IgA nephropathy. And that's one where, it missed,
I think.
Yeah. So it missed the traditional endpoints that you would want to see to get approval in that indication. But it did have a benefit on the proteinuria levels. So that'll be really interesting to see what happens there. And then the other indication was membranous nephropathy, which is an inflammatory autoimmune type disease where Roche has its anti-CD20 mAb with a potential SNDA submission this year and some phase 3 data.
Yeah, it's a really great table you put together for this story, as you can quickly see what the mechanism is, product, catalyst, timing. Great piece here, Lauren. We also had our colleague Stephen Hansen at it again with obesity, a space that he watches quite closely. Heading into 2026, Stephen says the obesity race is widening. There, I said it. Some recent readouts have been teeing up new mechanisms, new players that could challenge the standard. That's GLP-1, of course, on efficacy or convenience. The biggest obesity catalyst he is watching, it's already underway at this point, the launch of the oral GLP-1 receptor agonist. Novo's already out there. Lilly is going to follow. So if you're interested in the obesity space, definitely check out Stephen's story. It, like most of these other stories, comes with a very handy slide deck that you can kind of cruise right through and zero in on what's most interesting for you. You can download it and the like.
And when you go there, you'll see we have catalysts at different phases of the development spectrum, right? We have regulatory catalysts, we have phase 3 catalysts, but we also are really keen to look at proof of concept for new targets, new technologies, lots of proof of concept in there. And you'll find in the obesity one, there are some that follow this same theme of RNA therapies. So some of the newer targets, like inhibity, a genetic target, ALK7, a genetic target. There you have Alnylam, you have Wave Life Sciences with knockdown approaches and others.
A lot of interesting stuff happening. And well, Stephen does talk quite a bit about the titans in the space. I trying to remind Stephen not to use Titan so often, but it's rarely appropriate. But in this case, Novo and Lilly are some serious market leaders, but AstraZeneca had a very busy week last week. One thing it did was it kind of signaled that it's going to go all in on obesity via yet another China deal for the company. $1.2 billion up front, partnering with CSPC, one of the bigger players in China. The biobucks are, they're biobucky, $18.5 billion. And what Stephen wrote was that this is really showing that AstraZeneca is planning on joining Pfizer and Roche in making an all-in bet to compete with Lilly and Novo. Big week for AstraZeneca, big week for the UK and China. Simone, tear in the eye for your motherland?
Tear in the eye? I don't think so. Yeah, got to think about that one, Jeff. I think that it's just, to be honest, I think this is part of a broader geopolitical picture where the UK is cozying up to China, hedging, given that it's very unsure of where it is with the US. We know from AstraZeneca's point of view, AstraZeneca has been, I think, for a while now, the most heavily invested pharma or Western pharma, I should say, in China. They've had a very big footprint, notwithstanding some of the setbacks they've had. I just see this as part of a picture that is definitely led by AstraZeneca, not exclusive to them. A lot of farmers, I know, Steve, you got some thoughts on this that we'll tap into, but I think that, China is a very real alternative to the US and to Europe at the moment, because these are R&D moves that they're building there.
And one thing that was really remarkable, though, is that the press release that AstraZeneca put out about their $15 billion investment in China included a paragraph of quotes from Keir Starmer, the UK Prime Minister, hailing AstraZeneca's investments in China. And if you stop and think about it a moment, it's really difficult to imagine that scenario in the United States, for example, or anywhere else. Can you imagine a U.S. company investing $15 billion in China and a U.S. president coming out and saying, well, that's great. It's showing America's leadership. So it's, it's quite remarkable.
Yes. There's one bit of context that I want to add, which is, so the UK has made biotech and biopharma one of its pillars of growth, okay? It's one of its major pillars of growth. We know that China did a similar thing, 15 years ago, whenever. They basically set out a strategy to grow their biopharma ecosystem. And this is something that was never strategically done in the US. It's sort of, is that fair to say that, Steve? I know that there were, tax incentives in, say, Massachusetts and places like that, but I don't know that there was ever a top-down strategy. But what I'm trying to say is that I think that this move in the statement by Starmer is consistent with both the bigger geopolitical thing and the idea that the country wants to reinforce its own life sciences footprint.
Well, I think actually, if you look at what happened in the United States, what really created the biotech industry in the United States was a very happy confluence of public policy and science and economic opportunity. But it was based, the foundation of it was good public policy in the United States, starting from massive investment in basic science, support for IP, a world-class independent regulatory environment, and an immigration system that welcomed the best and the brightest from around the world. All of those things came together and made the biotech industry possible and made the United States, for a time, and maybe that time has passed, but for a time, it made the United States the absolute best place in the world to discover and develop drugs.
Well, speaking of Starmer and immigration, Simone, is there any truth to the rumor that Starmer is in negotiations with Spain for Carlos Alcaraz?
Now that would be a rumor worth reporting, I definitely think. But you know what, Jeff? There's really only one way to do this, and you just start a rumor, and maybe it comes true, which is what I think you just did there, actually.
I think I did, and it's no secret that Djokovic is the villain of the BioCentury This Week podcast. So extra kudos to Alcaraz.
I just want to say, Stephen Hansen, very lucky that he's not here. Very lucky he's still got his job, because he texted me at the wrong moment, causing Sinner to not convert 2 break points and end up losing. And so that was a very dangerous part of the weekend.
It was.
But we'll move on. Stephen Hansen has many other qualities.
I'm bracing to give him his performance review after that episode. All right, we're going to take a quick break, and we will be back to talk China. What else?
BioCentury This Week is brought to you by the 5th East-West Biopharma Summit in South Korea. An arc of innovation is emerging across Asia, and Western biopharma leaders are taking note, from cross-border deals to new co's. In March 2026, the 5th BioCentury Bay Helix East-West Biopharma Summit visits South Korea for the first time. Meet the biopharma leaders putting Korea innovation on the global map. Learn why Korea has become a clinical trial and manufacturing hub. Discover if Korea is the next hotspot for new co-formation. Plus meet biopharma innovators from India to Singapore to China and Japan. Register now at biocenturyeastwest.com.
Okay, we are back on the BioCentury This Week podcast. Check out our Catalyst package. It's awesome. What more can I say about it? Go read all 5 stories, 4 decks, and let's turn now to China, where Steve is extending BioCentury's long history of digging into the regulations that have unlocked biotech innovation in China, which shows no signs of letting up. Last week, we talked about the new rules that will accelerate the country's cell and gene therapy sector. And today, Steve, let's talk about the second story you wrote last week. New law taking effect May 15th, which for the first time is going to grant orphan drugs 7 years of market exclusivity, plus 2 more years of exclusivity for pediatric indications. What did you learn, Steve?
I think it is really interesting to see. This is another example, I think, of China looking at what were the pillars that I just mentioned before, the kind of the pillars of public policy that made the biotech industry flourish in the United States and in other countries. And orphan drug exclusivity was certainly one of them. I have to say, though, there's a great deal of uncertainty still, even though this law is going to go into effect May 15, about how it's going to work. And one of the elements of the uncertainty is something that you just mentioned. Okay, so there's 7 years of orphan exclusivity. There's 2 years of pediatric exclusivity. What isn't known yet, but will be, I think, before May 15 known, is whether that 2 years is going to be tacked onto the end of the 7 years for an orphan drug that is relevant for a pediatric indication, or whether that 2 years will be included in the 7 years. So we don't know if it's 7 plus 2, if it's 9 for an orphan drug for a pediatric indication, or if it's just 7 for an orphan indication, period, regardless of whether it's for pediatric or not. So I spoke with Cambridge CEO James Shuey, a former Genzyme executive, and he told me that there are other important unanswered questions about the orphan exclusivity, starting with the definition of rare disease. China doesn't have one. It has 2 catalogs listing 207 rare diseases, but obviously that's only a small portion, right? There's over 10,000 rare diseases. It also, as I said, there's also this uncertainty about how the 2-year pediatric exclusivity will work. But overall, what he said is that up until now, for orphan drugs, both for orphan drug development and especially as in terms of sales of orphan drugs, China has really been an afterthought. His hope is that orphan drug exclusivity will make China a viable market for orphan drugs, both for developing them and as a market for selling orphan drugs into China. I think there's still a lot of uncertainty that has to happen in order to make that happen. My personal view is that the orphan drug exclusivity, the impact of that, has been exaggerated in the United States. It was important, but the thing that really created the orphan drug industry in the United States was Henry Tamir, the CEO of Genzyme, figuring out that you could charge a great deal for orphan drugs, and that if you had orphan drugs that were really solving unmet medical needs, governments and other payers would pay very, very high prices for orphan drugs. And that created tremendous market incentive. It was bolstered by the 7 years of exclusivity because some of the orphan drugs had ambiguous or were lacking in patent protection. But the key to it is the reimbursement market in China, the reimbursement environment in China, I should say, is quite complex. But there is reimbursement for orphan drugs, especially for orphan drugs, and it makes it viable. What the CEO of Cambridge said to me is that it really makes it viable to develop and to sell orphan drugs in China for markets that are in what he called the kind of the medium range of medium rare, 10,000 and above. I think it'll be very interesting to watch, one, how this law actually is implemented in practice, and two, what its impact is, both in terms of creating a market for in-licensing drugs to China and also for China becoming a springboard for developing orphan drugs for the world market.
I think that's really interesting, the implications. So if it takes off and it supports development of orphan disease therapies in China, because there's now more exclusivity, a better market, presumably the clinical trial infrastructure would mature there for rare diseases. Because when some of us went to JP Morgan recently and we were running around talking to lots of companies. And one of the things I asked everybody I met was, well, who was heading into phase 1? I'm like, where are you doing your phase 1 trials? And when it came to rare diseases and a lot of rare neurological ones, nobody had China on their map, even though China is becoming a destination for clinical trials for all kinds of things, including early stage trials. And so I wonder if it will trickle down to that.
Yeah, that's going to be really interesting to watch. I don't think anybody knows the answer to that yet.
Where are they doing their trials?
Early stage trials, where are people doing them?
Yeah,
well, it depends on your modality. Like for some companies with genetic medicines, they don't find the US is especially accommodating. Some of the requirements here are a little burdensome. Sometimes what FDA requires for safety margins, it seems like that's still focused on what you would do for small molecules, say. So people are going to Europe, they're going to Australia, of course. Australia's been a destination. They're going to Canada. And increasingly, what I thought was really interesting is how many people said that they were at least considering a UK early or UK first, because MHRA has been very accommodating of late.
Interesting. And I'm hearing more and more that the UK is interested in becoming a magnet for that. Simone, didn't you look into something on that front? UK speeding up trials?
Yes. So Lawrence Talon, who is the CEO of MHRA, I forget what month it was, but he joined last year. He took the role last year. And I mean, the first thing they really wanted to do is stop the decline. Their time from their clinical startup time for first in human was very, very long. It had slipped from 150 days to 250. So I think the first thing that they wanted to do was return to par with the US or something like 150 days. But now they've gotten more ambitious. And like Selena, I'm also hearing more and more things coming out of the UK in terms of incentives and pathways for speeding entry to the clinic and reducing the burden. And we will be talking to them soon.
And I've also spoken with Lawrence Talon about that. And they've got kind of an integrated plan for taking advantage of some of the competitive advantages that the UK has. Excellent genomic data that, coverage and that doesn't exist in other countries. An ability, at least in theory, to link incentives for development of orphan drugs, especially for ultra-orphan diseases, to an HTA and to payment and reimbursement. And I think that they do. They definitely have the ambition to become a kind of a launch pad for orphan drugs, and especially for ultra-orphan drugs, with the idea that it'll be easier and quicker to develop them in the UK, and then to use the kind of imprimatur of the MHRA to gain rapid approvals globally.
All right. Thanks for that, Steve. Thank you for tuning in to the BioCentury This Week podcast. Like us, subscribe to us. Let us know what you think. We'd love to hear from you. We appreciate our listeners. And Lauren, Selena, glad to see you both still on your feet after that massive catalyst package. Steve, Simone, hope you continue to navigate the glorious weather that you're having in the Washington area. I know Lauren's really enjoying making snowmen in her yard over and over. All right, we'll catch you next week. Special thanks to Kendall Square Orchestra for providing the music for BioCentury's podcasts.